I would like to introduce to the stage Troy Dawson, 3D API engineer for Apple.
Hi, I'm with the OpenGL group at Apple, and today I'll introduce 4 rendering techniques to produce interesting graphics effects on Mac OS X using OpenGL. These 4 techniques will be cube environment maps, improved texture filtering, using dot texture combining to do bump mapping, and finally I'll talk about sensible shadow volumes. First, the up is cube environment maps. Here we have a single texture. This texture is used to map environment lighting effects onto a rendered object. As you can see, this is a spherical environment map. Both the front half and the back half of the environment is encoded in a single texture. We use this texture combined with OpenGL's texture combining operations and the automatic coordinate generation to simply render the environment map onto the rendered object, as you can see here. So that was environment maps. Next, I'll talk about cube texture maps. This is a cube texture map. As you can see, there's multiple faces of the images. The images are arranged in a cube structure. For use as an environment map, the cube texture map must have the faces arranged to form a cubic panorama that shows the scene as viewed from the object. Using cube maps is very similar to using regular two-dimensional textures. Instead of GL text image 2D, we use a new constant, which is the texture cube map. And as you can see, setting the texture parameters is very similar to using regular two-dimensional textures. After we've bound our texture map object, we need to download the textures. Downloading the textures images to the texture objects is very similar. We have these 6 new constants. Each constant corresponds to a face of the cube map. And as you can see here, I just go through the 6 constants and download them. These are cube maps, so the width and height must be identical. Rendering the cube maps is much simplified if we do use OpenGL's texture coordinate generation facility. For cube maps, we'll bind our texture object. We'll set the texture generation to reflection map mode, and we enable cube map generation. We enable the texture coordinate generation. If you note here, there are 3 dimensions to texture coordinate generation, while spherical map only uses 2 dimensions. Now I have a demo. This is from the NVIDIA site. This is the NVIDIA bubble demo, modified with local scenery. As you can see here, I have a bubble. This bubble is a cube map environment. I can rotate around the scene, and you can see the environment being reflected on the surface of the sphere. It works in all dimensions, both vertically. I can show you the actual texture images. Here are the 6 texture images of the cube map. As you can see, it does form a contiguous panorama of the scene as viewed from the rendered object. We can compare this panorama to a spherical map. Here you see the corresponding spherical map that was generated from these 6 images. As you can see, it has less information than the cube map. Roughly 40% of the texture map area is representing the front half of the environment, while the next 40% is representing the back half of the environment. The black areas are wasted space, which is about 20% of the spherical map. This inferior texture mapping results in poor rendering quality. Here you can compare the spherical map and the cube maps. So this is the cube map environment. And this is spherical map. So there's cube and spherical. So the quality is different and noticeably better for the cube map. Additionally, because cube maps are not viewer independent, you can see I have a very beautiful back view here. But if I were to go back to spherical maps, you can see that there's a singularity at the back of the texture, which results in this rather poor rendering. Thank you. So in summary, we saw that the texture maps for using cube maps for texture environments was better than spherical maps, mainly because they're easier to generate. Basically, spherical maps are generated from the cube maps, so if we skip that step, we can probably do it faster. Additionally, the texture maps for cube maps are viewer independent, so there's no singularity at the back. Next, I'll look at anisotropic filtering. You may have noticed in your applications that when you have a texture that's using bitmaps, when the texture becomes oblique to the viewer, you might notice that it has blurring effects. This is due to OpenGL subsampling the bitmap levels a little bit less than optimal. I'll show you a demo that will improve this. OpenGL has a new texture parameter which will allow you to improve this sampling. Here it is. If the driver supports texture or supports your anisotropic filtering, you can use this function call to get the maximum supported value. This number will range from 1 to some number like 8 or 16. The greater the available value, the better the texture filtering effect available. All you do to use this anisotropic filtering is you use this texture parameter set value, and you set it to desired value. The value set must range from 1 up to the maximum available value. Another demo. Here I have a test image. Currently I'm using bilinear filtering. So when I move the text image down, you can see some sparkling effects. OpenGL provides trilinear filtering to remove sparkling effects. But as you can see, when you use trilinear filtering, the texture becomes blurred, which isn't so good. However, if I raise the anisotropic filtering level, you can see that the image becomes sharp, even when it's viewed at a oblique angle. I have another image. Here we see trilinear filtered blurs out. But using the anisotropic filter parameter, we can see it's clear again. We saw how using the anisotropic texture filter parameter will improve your texture filtering when the textures are viewed obliquely. But this does require bitmap texture loading. But you can set the desired level because using this anisotropic filtering will give you a performance hit for fill rate. So you may need to reduce the level to keep your performance rates. The next is using the OpenGL texture combiner machinery to produce a per pixel dot product effect. Here's an overview of the process. The OpenGL texture combiner API allows you to use the texture stages to do certain texture combine operations. As you can see here, we will have 3 inputs to the texture combiners and 2 stages. The first stage will operate on the primary color operand and a texture operand. The output of the first stage will be given to the second stage to produce our final rendered image. Let's look at the actual dot product. The dot3 texture function operand for the GL texture combiner units will allow the texture units to do a per pixel operation. This is kind of a hack in that we have to encode the vectors of the dot product into both color and a texture map. As you know, the dot product takes two vectors and does the dot product operation to produce a diffuse lighting effect. The output of the dot product will be a scalar value, but we can duplicate this scalar value to make the output be a light map. To calculate the local light vector from the polygon to the light source, we can use this math. It's pretty simple. But the dot product operation requires that the light vector be in local coordinate space. So we must rotate this light by the inverse rotation of the polygon. In my code, I use quaternions, so mine looks like this. But I don't have a typo in my code, hopefully. After we've rotated the local light vector into the local coordinate space of the polygon, we have to encode that light vector into RGB color coordinate space. This is done like this. Here I'm using inside bytes as the color components. As you can probably figure out, the color components are mapped from 0 to 255. So a -1 vector component will map to 0, and a +1 vector component will map to 255. Additionally, you can do this encoding for all the vertices of your polygon. Here we have the second operand of the first stage. This is the normal map operand. This texture map image, each pixel of this texture map image encodes a single surface normal. The texture map image is blue because the blue component of the color corresponds to the direction out of the screen. Usually these surface normal maps textures are produced during your content creation phase by the artist who has a height map, and you apply a tool to convert the height map to a normal map. So let's look at the first stage. As described previously, we have the first operand, which will be the local light vector. Our second operand will be the encoded normal map. Here we set the operation to dot operation. Additionally, the first texture stage for the dot 3 combiner will allow you to scale the output, but I'll show you the code next. Here's the code that corresponds to the first stage. We're using the first texture unit as the normal map. So we bind the normal map to the first texture unit. Additionally, we set the texture combine operation to dot 3. The output of the dot 3 can either be a scalar value, alpha, or it can be an RGB. Here I set the output to be an RGB value. And then finally, I set the two operands of the operation. The result is would be the grayscale output you see here for the dot 3 result. The second stage of the operation simply modulates the output against an unlit base texture. Here's the code that corresponds to the second stage. I'm using the second texture unit for the base image. And again, I set the combiner operation to modulate. Then I set the first operand to be the previous output. Second operand will be the base texture. Next, we'll see the code that actually renders the image. It's a lot of code there, so let's look at one vertex. First, I issue the local light vector, which is an unsigned byte vector. Then I simply issue the two sets of texture coordinates from the source textures. As you notice, for each vertex of the polygon, I issue a separate light vector in the color. You can calculate these light vectors for each vertex of the polygon and issue it like that. And if the smooth blending mode is enabled, we can use the vertex interpolation mechanism to interpolate these normals across the polygon. However, you have to, there are issues about keeping the vectors normalized, but there are ways to get around that. Now I have a demo. Here I have a positional light source circling the source texture. You can see a per pixel light effect, perhaps. Let's move in so we can see it better. This polygon is a simple 4-vertex polygon. There is no geometry. But because of dot pretexture combine, we can see the lighting change depending on the local light vector. I can show you the colors of that correspond to the local light vector. Here you can see the color change. These colors are the encoded local light vectors. Here you can see, bizarre. Here you can see the geometry of the polygon is flat. Thank you. So in summary, you saw how you can use the OpenGL texture combine API to do a diffuse lighting effect with using texture units instead of geometry. It does require you to produce your normal map as a texture, and does require calculating the local light vector for each vertex. Or you can calculate the local light vector for the polygon. Finally, we have stencil shadow volumes. At the time? Oh well. This is going to be a quick session. I like shadows. Shadows are cool. Using stencil shadow volumes will allow you to do this effect dynamically. Using the stencil buffer to do shadows requires employing the stencil buffer and the stencil test. As you can see, the stencil test is part of the pixel pipeline. It's a new feature in macOS 10. We'll use the depth test and the stencil test for this operation. The operation can be simple or complex depending on your application. But the basic step is to first render your scene geometry normally, both color and depth. Then we construct our shadow volume. Then we stencil this shadow volume into the stencil buffer. And we use the stencil mask to render either a lighting effect or a shadowing effect, depending on your technique. The first step is to actually construct our shadow volumes. This can be very application specific, so I'm going to hand wave it a bit. But the general idea, if this is our local light, our positional light source, and this is a occluding object, we'll construct a separate shadow volume that will be extruded from the occluding object in the direction away from the light source. It's important that this shadow volume encompass the full scene geometry you wish to have shadowed. After we have made our shadow volume, we will stencil it with a pretty simple two-step operation. And at the end of the stencil operation, we'll have a stencil buffer where the stencil buffer will have non-zero values where the scene geometry intersects the shadow volume. Here's the code for that. The stencil operation only requires writing to the stencil buffer, so we disable the color and depth writes. Next, I will set up the stencil operation. The GL invert operand is important. This will set the stencil test action of the depth pass to invert the stencil buffer when the depth test passes for your rendered volume. Next, I simply render our shadow volume twice. First the back faces, then the front faces. Then I would reset the various state. After we have rendered our stencil buffer, stencil mask, we have several options to get the lighting effect. Perhaps the simplest is just rendering a two-dimensional overlay polygon with the shadow color and then using alpha blending. This works well, but does leave one artifact where the scene geometry within the shadow volume will still exhibit diffuse and specular lighting effects, which may not be what you want. To avoid that, you can do more complicated multi-pass scene rendering, where you render first an unlit scene, then you use a stencil mask you've created from your shadow volumes to mask out the diffuse and specular lighting effects. But this will slow your rendering down. Or you can do what I do, just render your shadow volume again as the color buffer using alpha blending. I'll show you that now. Here we have a sphere inside the shadow volume. I'll show you the shadow volume. As you might be able to see, the shadow volume fully encompasses both the sphere and the ground plane. This produces the shadow effect. I can move the ball inside and out of the sphere. Here you can see the shadow effect of the sphere. If I disable the depth test, the stencil test, like this, you can see how I render the shadow volume. The shadow volume using an 85% opaque alpha blend. So you can see the specular and diffuse lighting. If I use 50% opaque opacity, here you can see the effect is much more noticeable. But if you use 85%, it's not too bad. Finally, let's look at the two-pass operation in more detail. First, I'll show you the backplanes. The green corresponds to the backplanes of the shadow volume. Here are the front planes. By rendering both the back and front planes, you can see the cyan is where the back and front planes are both rendered. The blue region is where the front plane is rendered, but not the back plane. And you can see this blue region corresponds to the shadow area. Should I do this for a half hour, or should I continue? I guess. So in summary, you saw how you can use shadow volumes in stencil buffer and a multipass effect to create your shadow effect. It does require both using a stencil buffer and a depth buffer. And it's simple for my simple case, but using it in a real scene may be more complex than I presented. So you may have to optimize both your creation of your shadow volume and the fill rate and filling it.